Karen had always considered herself the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood. To her, the HOA rules weren't just guidelines, they were sacred laws carved into stone, and she believed she had the right, no, the responsibility, to enforce them with an iron fist. That morning, as she marched down the tree-lined street with her clipboard in hand, she noticed something that immediately set her blood boiling. A dark green Jeep parked in one of the driveways, a heavy chain looped through its front wheel and padlocked to a metal post. The sight was offensive to her eyes, as though someone had deliberately dared to challenge her authority. A vehicle like that didn't belong in her neighborhood. It was rugged, military-looking, with its matte finish and sturdy frame, a sharp contrast to the polished SUVs, minivans, and sedans that usually populated the cul-de-sac. To Karen, it wasn't just out of place, it was a violation waiting to be crushed. She stood there for several minutes, glaring at the Jeep as if her sheer disapproval could make it vanish. She rifled through her binder, flipping past pages of HOA codes, but she already knew exactly what she was looking for. No unauthorized vehicles, no visibly stored machinery, and no unsightly property fixtures. She underlined the line with her pen for emphasis, her lips curling into a smug smile. This Jeep wasn't just a problem, it was an opportunity. She had been itching to remind the neighborhood who held the power around here, and this was her chance. In her mind, she could already picture the owner's shocked face when they discovered that she had swooped in like a hawk to correct their transgression. Neighbors who walked by offered polite nods, but most avoided her sharp gaze. They knew Karen's type, she thrived on drama, and her sense of authority was inflated to the point where challenging her felt pointless. Today, however, she wasn't just scribbling violations on her clipboard. No, today, Karen was going to act. She was tired of filing complaints and waiting for the HOA board to follow through. If you want something done right, you do it yourself, she muttered, her eyes narrowing on the heavy padlock holding the Jeep secure. The decision formed quickly in her mind, and once it did, nothing could dissuade her. She stomped back to her house, heels clacking against the pavement, and disappeared inside. Minutes later, she reemerged armed with a pair of bright red bolt cutters, their long handles gleaming in the sunlight. She carried them like a warrior brandishing a sword, head held high as though the whole street should thank her for her bravery. The Jeep sat quietly, chained and silent, unaware of the storm about to hit it. Karen didn't hesitate. She set the cutters, jaws around the lock, grunted with effort, and squeezed until the metal groaned and snapped. The clatter of the broken lock hitting the pavement echoed louder than she expected, causing several curtains in nearby homes to twitch. Problem solved, Karen declared loudly, brushing her hands together as if she had rid the world of something vile. She glanced around, daring anyone to question her. A man 2 houses down paused mid-lawnmower and stared, his brows furrowing, but when Karen caught his eye, he quickly turned away, deciding that whatever nonsense she was up to wasn't worth getting involved in. A couple of kids riding their bikes slowed down to watch but then pedaled off when Karen barked, "Go on, play somewhere else." With the lock gone, she yanked the chain free and tossed it aside. The Jeep now sat unprotected, and Karen placed her hands on her hips, surveying her handiwork like an artist admiring a finished painting. She imagined how the owner would fume when they saw what she'd done, but in her mind, she was untouchable. She convinced herself that the HOA rules backed her up, that she was simply carrying out justice. It didn't matter that she had no official permission to cut locks or tamper with private property. She saw herself as the embodiment of the neighborhood's order, and she wasn't going to let some rebellious Jeep owner destroy the uniformity she prized so dearly. Still, not everyone shared her enthusiasm. A neighbor from across the street, Mrs. Walker, stepped out onto her porch with a cup of tea in hand. "Karen," she called out cautiously, "what are you doing?" Karen turned, flashing her neighbor a tight smile. "Enforcing the rules, just like always. That eyesore was chained up like some kind of junkyard prop, and I won't have it lowering our property values." Mrs. Walker frowned. "Are you sure you should be?" "Positive," Karen interrupted sharply. "If we let one person get away with this, the whole neighborhood will fall into chaos. Do you want rusty old cars piled up on every driveway? Do you want weeds and trash and God knows what else cluttering our streets? No, I am nipping this in the bud." Mrs. Walker hesitated, clearly unconvinced, but she knew better than to argue. Karen thrived on confrontation, and anyone who stood against her risked being drowned in a flood of HOA complaints, nasty letters, and relentless gossip. So Mrs. Walker simply shook her head and retreated back inside, muttering under her breath about going too far. But Karen didn't care. She strutted around the Jeep, inspecting it with the same authority a general might use when reviewing troops. She tugged at the handles, peeked through the windows, and even tried the ignition, though the keys weren't there. The vehicle was locked, but she saw that as another obstacle she could overcome if she wanted. Her mind spun with ideas, Perhaps she could have it towed, or maybe she'd put a bright orange violation sticker across the windshield. The possibilities thrilled her. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that this Jeep wasn't just some resident's toy or weekend project. It wasn't abandoned, it wasn't junk, and it certainly wasn't a violation of her carefully memorized rulebook. The Jeep was part of something far more serious, far more dangerous than her petty power struggles. Inside its rugged frame and hidden compartments lay equipment tied to a police task force, tools used for operations she couldn't begin to comprehend. Its presence in the neighborhood wasn't a threat to property values, it was a safeguard against something much larger, something the residents would never even realize. But Karen, in her arrogance, saw none of that. She saw only a chance to assert herself, to prove once again that she was the queen of her suburban kingdom. And so she stood there in broad daylight, bolt cutters still in hand, daring anyone to challenge her victory, blissfully ignorant of the storm she had just unleashed. The sun was just beginning its slow descent when the Jeep's owner finally returned. The distant rumble of the engine that preceded him was calm, deliberate, almost understated compared to the chaos that awaited him in the driveway. Dressed in plain clothes but carrying himself with an air of quiet authority, he parked his unmarked SUV beside the Jeep and immediately noticed something was wrong. His eyes narrowed, instinct honed from years of fieldwork flickering to life as he stepped out and scanned the scene. The chain that should have been looped tightly around the Jeep's wheel lay discarded on the pavement like a gutted snake, its padlock broken and tossed aside. He crouched down, fingers brushing the jagged edge of the cut metal, and the realization struck him with cold precision. Someone had tampered with his vehicle, a vehicle that was never meant to draw attention, a vehicle loaded with equipment and serving a purpose far beyond the understanding of the average homeowner. He straightened, jaw tight, and his gaze swept across the neat rows of suburban houses. Curtains quivered as neighbors peeked out, unwilling to involve themselves but too curious to look away. A few children lingered on bicycles at the corner of the street, whispering and pointing at the Jeep, their voices hushed with the thrill of forbidden gossip. The man didn't speak right away. Instead, he took out his phone and made a quick, quiet call. His words were clipped, professional, and tinged with urgency. "It's been compromised. Send the team." Within minutes, the once peaceful cul-de-sac transformed. A pair of dark sedans rolled up silently, followed by a black SUV. Men and women emerged, moving with practiced efficiency, their presence both intimidating and unmistakable. They weren't in uniform, but everything about their posture, their coordinated movements, screamed law enforcement. This wasn't the kind of law violation Karen had built her world around. This was something heavier, sharper, a reality that cut through her suburban fantasies like glass. Karen, of course, had been watching from her front window the entire time. At first, she wore her usual smirk, arms folded as though she were waiting to be thanked for her service to the community. But as the men and women surrounded the Jeep, checking every latch and seal, her confidence began to flicker. She couldn't understand why so many people had shown up for one, illegally parked, vehicle. And when the owner walked directly to her front door, knocking with a steady, forceful rhythm, her heart skipped. She adjusted her blouse, smoothed her hair, and opened the door with feigned calm. "Yes," she said sweetly, though her tone carried its usual edge. The man wasted no time. "Did you cut the lock on that Jeep?" Karen blinked, thrown off by his bluntness. "Well, of course I did," she said, her chin lifting with pride. "That thing was chained up like a junkyard scrap. Against law regulations, plain and simple. I took care of it." "You're welcome." The man's expression hardened, a mask of controlled anger. "That thing," he said slowly, deliberately, "is a government-issued vehicle. It belongs to an active police task force. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Her smug smile faltered, but only for a second. Karen recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "Oh, come on, don't be dramatic. It's just a Jeep, and if it really belongs to the police, then why was it sitting out there like some kind of eyesore? You can't just dump military trucks in people's driveways and expect me to ignore it." His voice dropped lower, sharper, cutting through her excuses. "That vehicle contained equipment used in ongoing investigations. Sensitive equipment. You tampered with it, you compromised it, and you destroyed private property in the process. This isn't just an HOA matter anymore, you've crossed into criminal territory." The color drained from Karen's face as the words sank in. For the first time in years, perhaps the first time in her life, she found herself unable to speak. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and then tried to muster some of her usual authority. I was just doing my duty as a member of the homeowners association," she stammered. "You can't expect people to live with." But she was cut off by the arrival of two more officers who stepped up behind the man, their presence looming, their eyes cold with disapproval. One of them held up the broken chain and padlock in a gloved hand. "This yours?" he asked her flatly. Karen shook her head quickly. No, I don't own that. I just removed it. For the good of the neighborhood. Removed it, the officer repeated, disbelief dripping from his tone. You mean you destroyed it? Ma'am, this isn't your neighborhood to police. You had no right to touch this vehicle. Her neighbors, who had begun to gather in clusters at the edge of their driveways, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. Whispers spread like wildfire, each retelling growing more animated. Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer, the woman who had terrorized them for years with citations and complaints, was finally being held accountable. Some stifled smiles, others exchanged knowing looks. This was justice, wrapped in irony so thick it felt poetic. Karen tried one last desperate angle. I didn't know, she cried. How could I have known it was yours? There were no signs, no badges, nothing. How can you blame me for protecting the standards of this community? The owner of the Jeep leaned in slightly, his voice calm but edged with steel. Because ignorance isn't an excuse. You acted recklessly, without authority, and interfered with law enforcement property. If you'd simply asked, if you'd simply minded your own business, none of this would have happened. But you wanted to play sheriff, and now you're facing the consequences. Tears pricked Karen's eyes, though she fought to hold them back. Her kingdom, her carefully constructed facade of power, was crumbling right there on her front porch. She glanced around, searching for support, but all she saw were neighbors watching silently, many of them barely concealing their satisfaction. Not one person stepped forward to defend her. Not one voice rose in her favor. The officers didn't handcuff her, though for a moment she thought they might. Instead, they issued a formal warning, documenting everything with precision. This will go on record, one of them told her firmly. And if anything like this happens again, charges will be filed immediately. Do you understand? Karen nodded weakly, unable to summon her usual bravado. She muttered something that might have been agreement, though her voice was barely audible. The officers turned away, returning to their vehicles, their focus shifting back to the Jeep and the equipment inside. The man who owned it gave her one last look, disappointed, disgusted, final, before walking away without another word. As the task force packed up and the street slowly returned to its normal rhythm, Karen remained frozen on her porch. The weight of humiliation pressed down on her shoulders, heavier than any HOA binder she'd ever carried. She had wanted power, recognition, control. Instead, she had gained nothing but scorn and the bitter realization that not every battle was hers to fight. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't afraid of her, they pitied her. And somewhere deep inside, Karen understood that this was only the beginning of her downfall.